wait for my parts. Thank you.
Okay, welcome everyone. You are at the very first meeting of Waking Up in the Middle of Everything. I'm glad you're here. Logistics-wise, I'll let Zachary explain the details, but I just want to let you know that this class will have some practice and some reading and some context. So we're all in for a treat. We'll be here every other Monday for a while, and we are really glad you're here. And I think that is all I will say for now. I'm really looking forward to sitting with you all. Zachary, I'm really looking forward to sitting with you. Welcome.
All right, is this thing on? It is. Nice. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it a lot. So I thought I would at least start by saying a few things about me, just so you know who I am. So I'm a priest, a non-resident priest at San Francisco Zen Center, and most of my activities are at the urban center on Page Street in the Lower Haight, basically. That's but you will not be surprised to hear that in the last couple of years, a lot of my teaching activities have been online. So I've taught a bunch of online courses, and the sitting group that I meet with every weekday morning, transitioned to online, and then briefly transitioned to in person. Then everybody, and it was like, no, we'd rather be online. So in any case, but nonetheless, I'm a priest at the San Francisco Zen Center, and the way that happened is kind of a story. So my mom was a Zen student in the late 60s, and actually studied with Suzuki Roshi, the founder and first abbot of the building that I'm in, a lot, right? And she did monastic retreats with him, and so on and so forth. And in about 1971, when his book was Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind was relatively new, she gave me a copy with an inscription in the flyleaf, and I've still got it somewhere. And I completely ignored it for about 20 years. And then one day I sat down and I made a handwritten bulleted list, because this was kind of before, it was easy to get your hands on PowerPoint or something like that. And I use this bulleted list to describe the features of my current life, and I held it up and I was like, this is my ideal life. And then I did a bunch of experiential sampling of what it was like to be living that life, and I realized that I was not really enjoying it, and I was being really a jerk to everybody that mattered to me, and a bunch of other stuff like that. And I was like, this is wrong, and I will fix it. And I will fix it by going to that place that my mom used to practice at. And there is some other information there, like we were friends. I grew up in Marin. We were friends with the Wattses and with all the people that founded Esalen and so on and so forth. So I spent pretty much my entire youth sitting around listening to people talking about enlightenment and so on and so forth. So I had all that stuff sort of installed somewhere in my brain, and it all came bursting out, and I went and started practicing at San Francisco Zen Center. And of course, literally everything that I thought about how it was going to pan out turned out to be wrong, but it's still good, right? So I appreciate it a lot, and I'm kind of happy I went through the exercise, right? And then, and I guess the only other thing I'd say about me as a practitioner is that for almost the entire 30 years or so that I've been practicing, I've not been a monastic resident. I've been for 3 months at a time, a month at a time, other stuff like that. But for pretty much the entire time, I've had family, I've worked a job, and I've had other preoccupations, including cycling and a few other things like that. My job has been, well, for 5 years in the early 90s when I was starting out actually practicing, I was playing in rock bands for a living. But for the entire rest of my professional life, I've been an engineer until I retired from it about maybe 10 years ago now, something like that, a little less than 10 years ago. And that included doing international standards for embedded wireless protocols, and it involved writing automated routers and placers for CAD systems, and it involved writing video games and a bunch of other stuff like that. So it was fun. So enough about me. What about the Buddha? Yeah. So, why would I think, well, I'm both a recipient and source of pretty extravagant suffering, and I know how to fix it, and the fix will be Zen practice, right? It's no news to anyone that human lives are full of suffering, right? Nobody needs to be reminded of that too often, right? We all have a lot of experience with it, and as far as we can tell, for as long as we have a record of what people were thinking about, they've been concerned with exactly this problem, right? If you look at like the early literatures of the world, the Odyssey and the Epic of Gilgamesh and all the rest of that sort of thing, like if you read the beginning of the Odyssey, there's a version of the Odyssey that was done by this modern playwright whose name I forget, but she's really great. And I saw it at Ashland about 5 years ago, and it starts out with Zeus, who's dressed exactly like Wayne Newton, and Athena, who's kind of dressed in sweats, standing on stage and having an argument, and Athena and Zeus is like, these humans, they're such a pain. We give them free will, and then they screw everything up, and then they blame us, the gods. I think we should kill all of them and start again, maybe with crustaceans or something like that, right? And then Athena goes, oh, Zeus, they're not all bad. Look at Odysseus. He's a great guy, and we've been kicking his ass around the Aegean for 10 years, 20 years. Why don't we, let him go? And so they have this, they resolve this argument, and they go off to be at least a little bit nice to Odysseus, right? But I mean, that's a capsule summary of the human condition right there, right? Like that we're really good at messing stuff up, right? And everybody's been aware of it forever, right? And they've been cooking up schemes whereby we should address this problem, right? And they include, all the ancient religions you can imagine, plus a bunch of, philosophical and soteriological systems, plus the yoga schools, right? There was this period of ferment in the, like 500 years or so BC, right? Where people were sitting around trying to cook up new solutions to this problem because it seemed like the old ones were not working all that well. So in China, you have Taoism, legalism, and Confucianism all roughly around the same time. In India, they're the yogic schools, but also Buddhism and then a bunch of other philosophical schools that arose roughly at the same time. And in the West, the pre-Socratic philosophers and so on. I mean, it really was kind of remarkable, right? And everybody was in some ways concerned with the same thing. Right? The thing that's kind of unique about the Buddhist approach, right? Well, how many people in this room are not familiar with the life story of the Buddha? Okay, that's good. So I'll sum it up a little bit. So the life story of the Buddha is that he was kind of the guy who has everything, right? In the usual story, he was a prince. There's a very good chance that the Buddha when he was young, was nothing like a prince because he was living in southern Nepal and in an area that was undoubtedly had sort of tribal governance and stuff like that. Right? But in any case, he was important, right, and had things, and he was destined for political power and success of various kinds and so on. And in the middle of it, he realizes that that's not satisfactory, and that it's not satisfactory because it's conditioned and impermanent and delusive, right? And promotes delusion, right? And there's a complicated story about how he comes to this conclusion, but nonetheless, he decides he's gonna quit being a prince, and he's gonna go off in the world and figure out how to solve this dilemma that has presented itself to him. And there's a great guy at City of 10,000 Buddhas in Ukiah. His name is the Reverend Hang Jor, and he's from Tennessee, I think, and he's a very good musician. He plays the banjo and the guitar and a bunch of other things. And he will not give a Dharma talk without bringing some kind of musical instrument, a mandolin or something like that, and flicking through a few songs. But one time I heard a talk by him, and he performed this sort of minor key talking blues, which is supposedly what the Buddha said when his wife woke up and said, "Where the hell are you going?" Right? And he's like, "Oh, I'm going to save the world from suffering." But anyway, that's what he did, and he went off. And the story is that he tried everything, right? So he had everything, and then he'd go to this yoga school, and he'd study, and finally the teacher would come to him and go, "You're pretty good at this stuff. Why don't you take my teacher training course?" And the Buddha was like, "No, that's not really worth doing it for me." And then he would go and study some philosophical system, and the teacher would come to him and say, "Hey, you're really good at this stuff. If you get a PhD." And he's like, "No." And finally he ends up living this extremely severe ascetic life in the woods, like eating one mustard seed a day or something like that. And how many people have seen the movie of The Life of Buddha starring Keanu Reeves? Okay, you should definitely watch it. You don't have to watch the whole thing, just to watch the part with Keanu Reeves as the Buddha, right? But it's called, the movie is called Little Buddha, and it, among other things, stars the guy that sang Wicked Game, Chris Isaac, and a bunch of other people like that. But in particular, it has Keanu Reeves as the Buddha, and the Buddha was really starving himself to death, and really just like making this utmost effort, and it really still kind of wasn't working for him. And in the scene in the movie, he's languishing, almost dead of hunger, on the bank of a river, and this beautiful young woman with a bowl of rice pudding comes up to him and says, "You look terrible. Have some rice pudding," and gives him some rice pudding, and he eats it, and he's like, "That feels pretty good." But that like ascetic self-denial wasn't really working for me, but also actually being a rich, powerful, royal guy wasn't really working for me either. I'm just gonna sit down here, and I'm gonna not get up until a solution occurs to me. And he does, right? And that's the story of the life of Buddha, right? And when he gets up and he thinks he has an idea about what's really going on and what both the explanation for and the solution to the problem of the human condition is, he says, "I couldn't possibly teach this to anybody. It's too complicated." And all these beings, starting with people and graduating up to gods and all powerful spirit beings, all come to him and go, "No, you have to teach this." So he does, right? And he manages to get together about 5 guys to give a Dharma talk. And what they are is they're his former colleagues in the ascetic practices business, and they all think he's a loser because he ate the rice pudding, right? And so they're like, "Come on!" And so he has to give them the most economical possible talk. And he basically says this, and this is what I was getting to with the whole, with giving, telling the story of the life of Buddha. He says, life is suffering, right? And it's translated in various ways, but we might as well stick with life is suffering. And again, I don't think anybody needs to have that explained to them, right? And then he says 2 very interesting things. He says, suffering. Okay, so the Buddhist teachings are a giant PowerPoint presentation starting with this talk that I'm just describing, and there are sub-bullets upon sub-bullets upon sub-bullets upon sub-bullets. And in the original talk, he doesn't list all the sub-bullets, but if you dig in and look at all the sub-bullets, basically, here's how he explains human suffering, right? So what are our greatest gifts as humans, do you think, in terms of our ability to kind of, get along in the world and get stuff and not die and all the rest of that sort of thing? What or at least not die immediately. What do you think they are? Any volunteers? You and then you.
Intelligence and capacity for complex social organizations.
Yes, that's really good. Yes, we have a very complicated, like unprecedentedly complicated sociality, right? What else?
I was gonna say compassion.
That's good. Yeah, that's part of it. Yes, but it is. Yeah, that's good.
I was gonna say like our ability to move and grab things and move stuff around.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I mean, but let's be clear, monkeys move stuff around too, right? But yeah, no, that's good. What else? Yeah, and so what goes with for let's say for a group of social beings, what are the main mental capacities or internal capacities that they use to create stuff and move stuff around? Right, and what's the substrate for their thinking? Yeah, exactly, language. Yeah, and so we've more or less covered it. Did you want to add something? Sorry.
I was just gonna say, like, empathy or mind reading, like,
Yeah.
understanding others.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So here's what humans are really good at. They have this unprecedentedly complex, semantically rich, grammatically effective linguistic ability. I mean, other animals communicate a lot, and some of them communicate pretty sophisticated stuff, but humans are really pretty good at language. And furthermore, so I have a daughter who at one point in her life was around 2, and we were talking on the phone, and she goes, Dad, today I discovered that I can talk to myself without saying the words out loud. And once we discover that, either it's all downhill, or we start thinking in this way that is remarkable, right? And so along with that, we have a pretty sophisticated capacity for long range planning. We can imagine and narrate a very complex plan and implement it. How perfectly we do that? Not super perfectly, but it's pretty sophisticated, right? You can build iPhones, you can build headsets, you can design embedded wireless protocols, etc. Right? So language, long range planning, and the emotional underpinnings and mental capacities for an astonishingly complex sociality, right? Like we have a sociality that involves layer upon layer upon layer, to the point where you can imagine yourself being part of a social group that has literally billions of people in it, and you can have an emotional charge around your membership in that group. That's crazy, right? But it's true. We're like that, right? It's amazing. So, and the Buddha's point about all this is that all of those capacities have very stringent requirements. And among the stringent requirements are, you need to have a sense of separate self and agency, right? And you need to have a model for the world and a model for yourself, and you need to be able to animate that model separately in the world in a way that makes sense in order to implement your protocols or manage your relations with this whatever layer of our complex sociality you're managing, et cetera, right? That sociality often, in human terms, involves status hierarchies in which we navigate, and in which that status accrues to that self model that we're carrying around, right? That's kind of how it works, right? And the Buddha says that's fine, but it's also a huge problem. And you can see why, right? So you have two people with self models standing up next to each other, and the activities of those self models and the self narratives that go along with them are underpinned with powerful emotional tags that are designed to produce action. That's how we act in the world, right? And when you do that, if you get two people that for some reason, because of their different perspectives on the world, disagree, you have a conflict, right? And sometimes, often, those conflicts lead to suffering. Furthermore, even just on your own, planning, navigating, acquiring status, acquiring food, all the rest of that sort of thing involves, actions which may succeed or fail, but we're predisposed to feel suffering when something about our self-monitoring, self-narrating goes awry. We are, right? If we tell a story about how things are supposed to go and it doesn't pan out, quite often it's a sense of we experience that as suffering. We experience that as disappointment, frustration, anger, or even murderous anger, right? Etc. So that's basically what the Buddha says, is our suffering is deeply entangled with all of the things that make us human, basically. That's what it comes down to. And then he says this other remarkable thing, which is it's not all suffering, right? And there's a possibility for relief from that. And I don't think anybody really needs to be convinced of that either, right? Like we have these multiple modes of engagement with the world. And there's the one that's mostly about modeling the self, modeling our activity, narrating and animating that self model in the world and so on. But also there's the mode that simply takes in the world without any of that, right? And everyone experiences that in one way or another, I think. That if you scratch an endurance athlete, you'll find somebody who will start telling you about how, right in the middle of the worst part of everything, all of a sudden it wasn't a problem, right? Amazing. Right? Or you scratch a professional basketball player, and I heard somebody say once, yeah, there I was in the middle of this court, and all it was, bodies moving in time, right? Yeah, exactly. All of that self-concern and self-assertion can disappear sort of magically, right? Did you have a question? Okay, so I didn't say this at the beginning, but I'll say it now, and it will be true forever. If you have a question, raise your hand, because it's way better to have a discussion than for me to be sitting up here blathering. Okay, so please, raise your questions anytime they come up, and we'll talk about them. So, life is suffering. We suffer because we're human. It's not all suffering, and there's a program, he says, that you can engage that offers relief, right? And the program has 8 bullet points, but you can meta bullet it into 2 major bullet points, which is mindful introspection, right? And exemplary conduct, right? If you can engage in mindful introspection and exemplary conduct, conduct that that helps keep the mind settled and helps keep the body healthy and helps keep our relationships clear. Like when I was doing international standards work, you get together these groups of 1,000 people, and they divide up into little groups, and they all work on stuff, right? And usually it happens on conference calls, but roughly once a month, the way I was doing it, I was in a meeting with thousands of people divided up into little groups and working on particular pieces of the standard, right? And after a while, you realize that some of these groups are incredibly effective, and some of them are not. And some of them are so ineffective that eventually they become laughing stocks and they get canceled. Right? And that happened a number of times while I was doing this stuff. And if you really pay attention, you start to see that the difference between the effective groups and the ineffective groups is it's kind of like this. Like, let's say the group has 30 people in it. And of those 30 people, most of them are reading their email for the entire meeting, right? But some of them are actually listening, and of those people that are actually listening, some percentage of them talk, and it finally boils down to, in a group of about 30 people, 3 or 4 people are the people that do all the work, right? All the actual writing and editing and so on and so forth, and if those 3 or 4 people don't have sufficiently lively, effective emotional quality with respect to each other, they're never going to get anything done. Right? They can meet, once have these plenary meetings once a month for 15 years, and they'll never converge on anything because they can't look each other in the eye and trust each other enough to have an idea together, right? And so they're basically screwed, right? So the conduct that he's talking about is, among other things, the conduct that supports that kind of emotional quality and give and take and so on and so forth. Right. So if you can conduct yourself in such a way that your compassion and discernment are alive in the world, and you can engage in mindful introspection, that's the practice of liberation and being awake, basically. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm gonna try to say this in a few ways because I don't know exactly how to put it, but so Buddha said life is suffering, but we're also saying sometimes there are these moments where there does not seem to be suffering, or maybe I'm misunderstanding and there's just less suffering or something like that.
So it can be no suffering at all. Yeah.
So he says life is suffering, but then he also says that it's possible to not have suffering.
Yeah.
And then what I'm also wondering, so that makes sense to me. That's I've learned that in my understanding of Buddhism. And then I guess what I'm also wondering is it true that life is suffering? Is it possible to, as I've thought about the concept of non-dual things, things, can it just be one thing as opposed to this is sometimes it's suffering, sometimes it's this? Can it just be this thing, this one thing instead?
It's an interesting question. So I think the truth about that is that, so there's a famous Buddhist, Tang Dynasty Buddhist poem called sort of the merging of difference and unity, or no, maybe that's not it. Anyway, it says, basically, practice is easy. This practice of relief from suffering is easily, readily available. All you have to do is avoid picking and choosing, right? and you can see the hook there, right? The problem with it is that we're predisposed to based on limited information make choices about what's going to bring us resources, make our lives good, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And that picking and choosing is the as it, you know, driven by grasping and aversion and so on and so forth, is the thing that gets in the way of it just being one thing, right? It is absolutely the case that you can simplify the temporarily simplify the circumstances of your life such that there's almost no picking and choosing, and it's just, you know, vast, shiny spaciousness underlaying with unconditioned appreciation and gratitude, right? That's great. And there's a famous Zen master, Tang Dynasty Zen master, that commented on this, and he goes, yeah, the way is easy, but just avoid picking and choosing. But as soon as you open your mouth, you're picking and choosing. That's what he says, right? And so if that includes going down to Trader Joe's to buy the ice cream, and it includes, you know, having an argument with your least favorite colleague at work, and so on and so forth. So that's the problem, is that we live a life that requires us to use these matchless gifts that humans have, and for the most part, they're pretty great, right? They work well, right? But they have this, they have these complicated aspects that we have to learn how to live with, and the prescription for living with them is essentially, you know, according to the Buddhists, it's just practice, right? And as Buddhism developed over time, it became clearer and clearer to Buddhist thinkers that the key to actually living that life is to engage in a continuous practice of being awake, right? Which means that you're always standing right near the other mode of being, the one that's not involved with self, you know, grasping and self-concern and all the rest of that sort of stuff, right? You stand as close as possible to it all the time, while allowing yourself to go buy the ice cream at Trader Joe's, right? Anyway, does that make sense, or what do you think?
Yes, that makes sense, I think.
Yeah.
It's I'm getting like, well, we're always making choices no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
So
and those choices are pretty much always underlain with emotional tags, which are designed to narrow our focus and make it so that we act out the choices, right? Yeah, and are a subtle or gross source of delusion, right? Like, this is the most important thing in the world, I have to do this thing, right? Yeah. Anyway, but yeah, it's an excellent question, right? And it's worth asking, and it's worth asking also how to bring that question to your everyday activity, right? And that's kind of what we're going to do in a bit, right? So, you know, fast forward, let's say 1700 years or something like that. Nobody really knows when the Buddha lived, but Buddhism had spread all over the world, all over Asia, and subtly into European thought as well, right? And it was just landing in in the process of landing in Japan, and there was this guy whose name was Dogen, and he was a ward of the imperial court, and then his mom died, and everybody said, okay, he needs to go off to a monastery, and they sent him to this monastery, and he was highly educated and really smart and arrogant and kind of a pain. And after a while, everybody at the monastery was like, there's this Zen guy that just showed up, Japanese Zen guy. We think you should go study with him. And so he went there, and unfortunately that guy just died, but his successor was there, and they hung out for a while, and then his successor, this guy named Zen, said, okay, we should go to China and study. So they went to China, and he banged around China and didn't really click with anybody, and kind of thought everybody was, too concerned with fame and fortune and problematic in one way or another. And then he finally runs into this guy named Tiantong Wujing, who lived right near the present-day town of Ningbo in a little tiny pocket-sized mountain range. And there's a temple. There's still a temple there, and on it has a little plaque from the Japanese Soto Zen organization that says Dogen studied here. But anyway, he goes there, and he meets his teacher, and his teacher is really great, and he has a lot of significant, like life-changing experiences. And then he comes back to Japan, and he goes bounding in the door to some temple in Kyoto, and goes, hey, it's so great, I've been doing this Zen stuff, everybody should be doing it. And they ran him out of town on a rail. And he was living by a lake, by Lake Biwa in the country, in a little tiny rundown country temple. And he goes, I need a manifesto. And so he wrote this thing called Everybody Should Be Sitting Zazen. And that's, this Bentley thing, only it's a translation, right? And in it, he says a few things, and then he talks about how to sit. So we're going to sit. So, but I guess first, do you or anybody else have a question about what all the stuff I just said? You first.
I was wondering if you could say more about what you described as emotional tags underlying your choices, and
Yeah.
Is there a bit? Are we trying to avoid those or minimize
No.
those, or are we
don't have
how
any.
do they fit into the?
We don't have any choice about them, right? They're kind of what make us work. Like, you ever run across a book called Descartes' Error? It's a really good book. And basically, it's a critique of pure reason. Basically, it takes the idea that our thinking is purely reasonable and totally disembowels it, basically. And it has a lot of neuroscience in it, and a lot of examples of people who have become aphasic in some way, or have lost the ability to attach emotion to their mental activity, and they're totally lost with respect to decision making. Like, there's this one example of a guy he's a lawyer, and he's actually quite a good lawyer, right? But he's had brain damage, and I forget for what reason, which makes it hard for him to apply emotional tags to his thoughts and actions, right? And the doctor that was working with him would try these tests. Like, he'd put a document down in front of him, and he'd put 3 pens down, and he'd say, here, sign. And the guy would be like, and finally the doctor would say, what's going on? He says, I can't pick a pen, right? It's things as trivial as that. Like, but when you see 3 pens, you're like, I want this one. And there's really not a whole lot we can do about it. And furthermore, like, if the Buddha had gone to his 5 former colleagues in the business and said, life is suffering, and Suffering arises from the emotional drivers of our behavior and thoughts, and the solution is just to not feel anything. Hopefully, everybody would have gone, no, we're not doing that, and gotten up and walked off, and there wouldn't be Buddhism, right? Because it's a terrible idea, right? Everybody every day should feel the full range of human emotions, right? And those emotions should drive our activities, right? That's what they're for. The thing to be aware of is that those emotions can be dangerous and difficult, and can as I said, can narrow our focus to the point where we don't see what's going on. And so it's worth noticing that as well. And part of the practice of Zazen is to bring ourselves into a mode where those emotions are apparent, but they're not the only thing in play. Does that make sense? Or what do you think?
I think my question was how it relates to suffering. I think you got to that, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. And then you had a question as well, right?
I think I missed maybe a cog wheel when you were talking about the emotional qualities that should be effective on conference calls,
Mm.
and then how that connects to the one of the paths of Buddhism.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I was just saying that if you take the top level bullet points that hang over the Eightfold Path and all the sub bullets, they're engage in mindful, introspection, right? And conduct yourself so as to be settled, comfortable, and emotionally clear, right? Because that makes it easier to engage in mindful, introspection. And the mindful introspection also can, in a feedback loop, drive, clarity and positive conduct, right? So anyway, that was, and that, the emotional quality thing was an example of how our conduct, even subtle and not particularly obvious conduct, can make life much more difficult for us and for others in a way that makes it harder to relax, harder to rest, harder to. There's another koan where there's a Song Dynasty Zen master and a kind of Theravada Vinaya master, and they're having an argument, and one of them says to the other, the Vinaya guy says, he says, I've sworn to obey all these precepts, and the Zen master says, yeah, I obey those too, but I have a few others. Like I eat when I'm hungry. When I'm tired, I lie down and go to sleep. And when it's too hot, I kind of take off a shirt and sit by a window. And when it's too cold, I put on a sweater, right? And the Vinaya guy goes, everybody does that. And the Zen master says, really? The main point is that it's possible to live in such a way that our choices are obvious and pretty unfraught a lot of the time, and then it's possible to live in a way in which our entire life is one long moral conflict, and so on. And the standards for conduct are designed to promote the former rather than the latter. That's all. Does that help? I'm sorry. I'm not.
Still a little bit.
Okay,
lost
good.
about the standards of conduct, but
Yeah.
it's supposed to be that you follow them. It's simple and you stay awake. And
Yeah, it makes it easier to stay awake
Yeah.
when you conduct yourself in a measured and thoughtful and kind of perceptive manner, right? Yeah, eventually I'll get around to the three great bodhisattvas, but probably not today, but one of these days. So anyway, so Dogen wrote this this document, which is a rough translation for which would be everybody should be sitting zazen, right? And he says basically the way of being in the world that offers freedom is universally available to everyone, right? And you don't have to go do anything in order to get at it and so on. The problem with it is, he says, if the least like or dislike arises, then he says the way is as distant as heaven from earth. It's like, and he says, so stop thinking too much, overthinking stuff, studying too much. He's sort of, to be fair, criticizing a number of present-day Buddhist schools that mostly focused on textual study and stuff like that, and actually practice being awake. That's what he says. And here's how you do it. And he says, okay, so find yourself a quiet room, put some matting on the floor and put a cushion on it, right? And then he says, sit either in the full lotus or half lotus position, which you don't have to do, but I'll demonstrate because it's useful to talk about. So if you wanted to sit in full lotus, it looks like this. He says you put your right foot on your left thigh and your left foot on your right thigh. And some people can do this and some people can't. And that's fine, right? But it's worth noting something about the full lotus posture, which is that it pulls your knees in and it balances the down pressure on your knees, which is good, right? And then he says, okay, well, if you can't do that, then sit in half lotus. And he says, you just press your left foot against your right thigh, right? You'll notice that my knees are a little further apart now, which is okay again, and it's a little different to find the balance point, but half lotus is good. There's a bunch of other postures that people have used, cross-legged postures that people have used. This one is called Burmese. You can tuck one foot in and leave one foot out. That works. You'll notice that my knees are much further apart. And you can sneak this, to move your knees a little closer together, you can sneak this foot up a little bit, right? That works. The reason why it makes sense to pay attention to how far apart your knees are is you can feel it. If you bring your knees in like this and your feet are aligned forward, your knees are aligned forward, the stress on your psoas muscles in your upper thighs is actually quite different than if you move them out here, right? And that stress, if you're sitting for a while, can be problematic, right? So those are some cross-legged postures. You can also sit in this. Let me say one more thing about that. In the standard cross-legged postures, the preference is for having your knees solidly planted on something, right? And so if you can do that just based on the available twist in your hips, that's great. If you can't, as you've done, it makes sense to rest your knees on something because they want to be supported, right? So that's good. And often people have one knee joint that's a little bit more difficult. So put a support cushion under that. That's fine, right? It's perfectly good. The other options are, there's a essentially a yoga posture, which in Japanese is called seiza, that looks like this. I mean, this is the simplest version of it. You just sit on your legs, and this, I have to say, is an incredibly comfortable position, but invariably after a while, your legs start to fall asleep, right? And right, exactly. So there's a couple of ways to elevate yourself. One of them is to use a bench like that, which is awesome, right? Those are good. And the other one is you take a cushion and you stuff it under your, what have I done? Upside down. You stuff it under your sit bones and it supports you. So those are fine. And in both seiza and the cross-legged postures, the goal is to have your butt firmly planted on something and your knees firmly planted on something. So you have this kind of tripod of support for your upper body. Right? So that's the lower body part. And everybody should just explore what works for them, right? So yeah, that looks good. If you want to get a support cushion, get a support cushion.
Does anyone want something?
Looks good. Yeah. So once your lower body is settled, right, and you feel like you're supported, evenly supported, you might try rocking back and forth, and you can do it just by differential pressure of your knees on whatever they're resting on. Right? I notice nobody's sitting in a chair. You can also do this sitting in a chair, and the injunction there is firmly plant your butt and firmly plant your feet. Right, but since we're all sitting on the mat, so rock yourself sideways, back and forth, so that you can, if you rock left, eventually gravity grabs you and you fall. If you rock right, eventually gravity grabs you and you fall. Somewhere in the middle there, you're upright with respect to your kind of left-right axis or something, right? And then forward and backward the same way, right? Find the middle point. And then you want to have a straight spine. And the way to have a straight spine is to have a curvy spine. Right? Your spine has these natural curves. It curves in at the base, out sort of at the shoulders, between the shoulders, in at the base of the neck, and then out at the back of the head. And those curves should be well expressed and relaxed. And one way to kind of do that is you imagine that your head is being lifted up from the crown. And what that does is it naturally brings your face into a vertical plane and your nose kind of in line with and right above your navel. Let the energy in your shoulders be out and down. Then you bring your arms around in a circle and you put your left palm on your right palm. Bend out into another circle. Let the thumb tips touch lightly and let that rest right about here. So your thumb tips are near your navel and the fingers of the little fingers on your hands are pressed right up against gently up against your lower abdomen. Yeah, always good. there's a sweet spot for this mudra, which is somewhere around here. And if you find it, you'll discover that the space in between your hands kind of warms up a little bit and it feels lively, right? That's the sweet spot.
Question.
Yeah.
On this mudra, is it supposed to sort of be taking effort that like you have to hold it there, and if you were to relax it, go down?
Yeah, interesting question. So it's supposed it can take a very, very small effort, right? And if it feels like it's taking a lot of effort, you might discover that you're holding it too high. But I have some advice for you. You're using Seiza. You should try this mudra instead. So put your right thumb inside your right palm, fold your left thumb over it, and then fold your hands around like that and hold that here. And that actually hangs a little higher naturally because it shortens the circumference of the circle in your shoulders. And it's actually that's a martial arts and Rinzai style mudra. But if you wanted me to demonstrate that again, I'm happy to do it.
Right.
Yeah, that looks pretty good. Well, except the thumb on your left hand should also be tucked inside your. Yeah, wrap it around your other thumb. Yeah, there you go, like that. Yeah, that's good. So if you're sitting Seiza, it can be helpful to put your right thumb inside your left palm, wrap your left thumb around it, wrap your whole hand around your thumbs, and then fold this over like that and hold it there.
Got
it. And the guy that taught me this was a kendo master, and he said, this is what the guy sitting outside the shogun's door, guarding the door, did, and they would have a pike in here. So you can imagine that you're holding a pike in your hand, which I'm not sure if that's particularly useful, but it at least demonstrates the direction that it should be pointing, right? So something like that.
Probably the most effective weapon in history.
Right. And you can stick one in your mudra, right? Because they would sit outside and Seiza literally all day long. Anyway, so now that we've mostly got a posture, try this. So open your eyes. We always sit with our eyes open, and I unfortunately can't do this, but everybody else should have their mouth closed and their tongue gently resting against the front roof of their mouth. Unless you have a cold, in which case you can breathe a little through your mouth. So breathe in, and then when you've breathed in, kind of put some energy in your hara, which is this place right underneath your navel in the middle of your body, or maybe 2 or 3 inches underneath your navel in the middle of your body. It's sort of the bottom of your breath, right? Put a little energy there and let the breath just collapse out of the body into the heart. It kind of feels like this. You're like, and pause. When your breath wants to come in, just let it come. And again. Yoga students will recognize this as a particular form of Ujjayi breathing, right? So that's the breath. But you do it in a way that's not as exaggerated as is what you do in a yoga class. In fact, you wouldn't normally make any noise with your breath when you do it. But there's still this thing of you kind of lock your hara, you let the breath collapse into the hara, and then it can feel like the breath rises up out of the hara and fills the body when you breathe in. Right? And so to do that a few times, and then just sit. And watch your breath. Watch it leave the body. Feel the pause where there's hardly anything going on. And then feel the in-breath. Keep your eyes open and your gaze not vertically wide, but laterally wide. It's as though you can see the entire periphery of the room. And you're just seeing, not looking, just taking in the light, just taking in the patterns. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to sit for about 25 minutes. Every now and again, I'm going to blurt out, what is it? And I want you to note what was going on right then, really is in as intimate detail as possible, and kind of just remember it, particularly if there's something remarkable about it. And maybe we'll talk about it a bit after. What is it? Thoughts running, physical sensations. What was going on just when I said that? Just to notice. And then to pay attention to what happens after you notice. By now, some of you may have had a thought or two. It's okay. It's the other thing we do a lot of is thinking. It's okay. But to notice how sometimes we're present, sometimes we're tangled up in thought, and the transitions between those things are asymmetrical. Notice that you can be present suddenly in the middle of thinking. And use that moment to really notice what's going on. What is it? Just to notice, just to be in the middle of it, just to be awake right there. You don't have to do anything else, just be there with it. And attend to what happens after. What is it? That's good. So, does anybody have any questions about that? And also, does anybody have any observations about what was happening when I said, what is it? And yes, please make yourself comfortable, whatever position you want to sit in is great. Any questions, any thoughts, anything you noticed? Go ahead.
Very strong I really want to close my eyes
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
I had contact when they're drying out, and also that's an excuse. I just want comfortable meditating, my eyes closed.
Mm.
I feel like I can kind of retreat to formless realms or very empty spaces, and I keep my eyes open. I like have to stay here, and then my eyes kind of started having a lot of freaky deaky visual artifacts and like fluctuating colors and stuff.
Yeah, totally.
So it's like, yeah, after image, slightly move from the image and then kind of shimmering.
Yeah, it's funny when you sit in a Zen temple, you're usually staring at a wall. It's about this far away, and once your gaze really settles down, what comes into focus is the structure of the back of your eye. So you've got a foveal area here that there's nothing coming in from it, but it often shows up as some sort of shimmery disc, right? And then there's this really kind of surround where things are really contrasting sharp, and then this sort of fuzzy stuff, and then out here it gets all kind of, like it's as though it's feathers or shrubbery or something like that, right? What do you think could be the motivation for leaving your eyes open?
My guess is that it keeps us kind of grounded in actual, in the word of the senses.
Yeah, exactly.
My guess is that it prevents dullness.
Yeah, I think those are accurate, right? So the function of meditation in the Zen school is primarily to stay attuned to the actual contents of the phenomenal world as finely and intimately as possible, right? Because the philosophical underpinning of that is that that's where we wake up, in the phenomenal world, right? And so, and this is true for all your sensory modalities, but it's especially true for your eyes. When your eyes are open, the big chunk of hardware in your head that goes, okay, we should be paying attention now, right? And so there's that, right? It also sometimes helps with dullness, although honestly, you can get really sleepy sitting with your eyes open too, right? And they can sneak closed on you. And my experience with that is that that's fine, right? So you let them sneak closed, and something else happens, and then you can open them up again. It's okay, right? But I would just experiment with it and see what it does to your to the particulars of your mental state, right? It's just an exploration. Right? So, go ahead.
It's really interesting. I've done some eye-opening practice before under very different instructions, right? And this was more subtle, but what I found most interesting was the question, what is it? It's like, it's the impersonal singular pronoun.
Yeah.
And I take it as an opportunity that there was no, it would just, I guess I just kind of search. Like, what is it?
Yeah.
And it was very, the whole Supa phenomena seemed a lot more synesthetic when we were doing this practice.
Yeah.
It was kind of blended together, and I have no idea.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, that's really good. That's excellent, right? Like, it will probably not be news to you, but everybody has a cycle of attention, right? And the usual cycle of attention is, so when you sit down, you're generally, for a little while, you're at least present with your body, and because you just sat down, right? And you just arranged your posture and so on and so forth. And then what happens is a thought comes up that has enough juice in it to pull your attention in. And that transition is really, really hard to catch. In fact, it's actually, my theory is that it's impossible to catch, right? And because what goes on is there's this kind of erasure. Your mode of self-constructing rumination goes, no, you should be paying attention to this. Don't pay attention to any of that stuff, right? And all of a sudden you're in the mode of self-construction and self-narration, right? And you're ruminating, right? But magically, and sometimes you can notice a cause, and sometimes you can't, right? Sometimes there's no apparent cause. All of a sudden, you're aware again, and you're not totally wrapped up in rumination and self-construction. There's this sort of more general awareness, right? And the places you land when you become aware like that are crazy, amazing. Like, and it gets weirder and weirder. Like for a few, like, once I was sitting at a 7-day retreat, and I started attending to my body, and I realized that my body was just about exactly the size of a basketball, and perched neatly on top of the zafu I was sitting on, and I was like, wow, my body is the size of, it's perfectly round, and it's the size of a basketball. And I sat there for a while, and then the feeling kind of softened up and opened up, and then I was back in my body in sort of regular shape again, right? Or a few months ago, maybe 6 months ago now, I was walking on Mount Tam and on the west side. I don't know if you know about the west side of Mount Tam, but it has it's very, very steep, and it has these narrow canyons, and tucked into each canyon there's a little forest, right? Because there are creeks that come down and they water the trees, and the rest of it is just open grassland, right? And it was a season where there was a lot of migratory birds, and I was walking along, and I walked into one of these forests, and all of a sudden the entire forest, all the trees in the forest were full of these little tiny birds, and they were all going like that, right? And there was this moment where all of the ticks mapped out the entire shape of the forest, right? Like I could feel it, and furthermore, it wasn't that just that I could notice the shape of the forest. It was inside my body, right? So yeah, it really does get out there, right? When you allow yourself to pay attention like that, and it doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to make sense, right? There's a anyway, something like that, and I could go on telling stories about this, but anyway, anyone else? Yeah, go ahead.
I got into my rumination.
Yeah.
And then I observed I'm ruminating. And then I said, I want to keep ruminating, and I'm going to pay attention to the fact of my. I've sat before and I've been able to come back to the breathing present, but somehow today it was so compelling. And then the progress I made is that I guess the standard way of asking a question shifted to a different question. So paying attention simultaneously to the fact that I was ruminating helped a little bit, but it wasn't the general presence, I guess.
Well, it's great because as you're pointing out, right, when you become aware in the middle of thinking, you're not only aware, you're aware of the tail end of some thought event, right? And you can actually let it run for as long as you like, right? It usually what happens is, my experience with it is that the emotional tags on the thought event soften up a little bit when you become aware, and so the sometimes the thinking fizzles out, but that's not always true. If you do this a lot, you'll invariably get to this place where you're completely aware, and the entire world is this. Well, okay, so here's my metaphor for it. The image that I came up for. Imagine yourself in a hockey rink, at midnight, right? All by yourself, except there's a little group of people also visiting the hockey rink that are walking around. So you're in this bright, almost infinitely large, shiny space, and there's a little group of people and they're talking. Sometimes they come a little closer, you can hear what they're actually talking about, and then they go away. And your rumination is like that, right? It can completely share the space with the other mode of engagement, right? And it turns out more generally that those two modes of being are operating simultaneously almost all the time, right? And the reason why we don't notice the spacious, relaxed one so often is that we're often too busy thinking, right? But one of the gifts of practice, if you do it in this particular way, right, that's not loaded with ambition, is that it becomes more and more possible to have your attention just move easily between those two modes without really any seams at all, and where they're visible from each other, basically, something like that. Does that make sense? Or yeah. And that's how to do it. Is to essentially surf your cycle of attention. It's a form of surfing. Right? It's just that the waves sneak up on you rather than you having to paddle to catch them. They but it still is surfing. Right? Anyone else? Go ahead.
That was sort of my question. So it's not necessarily like a concentration practice. It's more of like a choiceless awareness practice.
Right. Okay. And yes, and sometimes concentration is good. A little concentration is good to keep you present. But yes, absolutely, that's right. It's the the goal is a kind of continuous choiceless awareness that when it's presented with the requirement to make a choice, takes in all the energy and information in the moment, both inner and outer, and allows that to dictate what you do, basically, over and over and over again. And then, something about the three great bodhisattvas, and I'll talk about some other time. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I wanted to mention like something I was thinking about.
Yeah.
It's like, and I've also been thinking about this more generally, but it came up again today. During one time when you asked like, what is it? I feel like I've been kind of in a struggle that I've kind of been wrestling with this idea or this thing that I've been observing myself with kind of like I feel like kind of at war a little bit with like my visual attention. It's like sometimes I find myself fixating on something that I'm looking at, like I'm really looking at it hard, and then I'm like, oh, but I don't want to do that. I want it to be softer. So then I'm like, okay, well, what if I just try to focus on like my body feel? It's like maybe a feeling inside my chest, which is sometimes strong, instead of this visual thing that I'm doing. And I feel like I'm kind of tugging in between these two things, and it's like I haven't been able to find that nice horizontal, soft looking, because I don't know what to look at when I do that.
So it turns out that all of your sensory modalities have this set of properties, right? So with seeing, there's three modes of your visual modality. There's three modes. There's seeing, looking, and not seeing. and seeing is just bringing in the light and the pattern, and occasionally maybe an object suggests itself, like tofu, right? And and it's kind of relaxed, right? And then looking, we want to look. Our eyes want to focus on things, take them in, and explain them. Focus on something else, take it in and explain it. And so to notice where you are with that is one of the functions of working with your visual modality. But the same thing happens with hearing, right? If you close your eyes, you have similar experiences with hearing. You can be listening, you can be hearing, or you can be not letting in anything at all. And when you're not letting anything in at all, it's usually because, again, you're tangled up in rumination, right? So I would say just focus on keeping your gaze wide. Don't squint. Don't, have your eyes relaxed, and just it's like with your breath. Like if you're watching your breath, eventually you're distracted from watching your breath. Just bring yourself back there when you're working with your eyes. If your eyes start looking around, just let them settle again. Maybe make a little subtle effort to settle them, and then let go of that effort and just watch what happens next. It doesn't have to be. It doesn't have to be all one way. Your eyes can saccade around and then settle out, but eventually they're going to settle down. That's been my experience. And eventually their gaze gets pretty relaxed, actually. And as you say, also bringing attention to the rest of your body can be helpful. Like for me these days, mostly I'm focusing on the particular yoga of my breath and the particular framing of my gaze, basically. And it's good. And it feels pretty relaxed, and I can do it for as long as I need to, basically. Yeah. Well, Go ahead.
I just want to make sure if anybody else who hasn't spoken has to say. I'm just wondering about, for example, emotion rather than rumination, and in particular, things that are considered sort of negative emotions, like anger in particular, and whether there's an invitation to try to create that distance from anger, that ability to observe your own anger, and how does that contrast to other approaches to healing or psychology or happiness that say you should allow yourself to fully feel the anger. Like I guess I'm interested in how how to relate to intense emotion.
Yeah, well, right. So again, intense emotions are part and parcel of the actual experience of being a live human, right? And the practice of Zazen and Buddhist practice in general is to be fully alive, right? So it can be difficult to invite strong emotions, right? Because they usually work like this. You have a strong emotion, it gives rise to a narrative. That narrative spins up, even stronger emotion. They can spin up like this, they can spin down like this, and emotions are almost all, in large part, cultural constructs. We learn how to enact them, and then we do them, right? And we've learned that stuff, way back in our life, and it's built in, and we use it to move us in the world, right? So it really, but if you embed in your body this practice of opening to the experience of the moment, which is what we're talking about here, right? That's what that process is, what Zazen is intended to install in your body, right? Then what you discover is that you can use your own experience. Here is a strong emotion presenting itself as a trigger to open up and attend to what's actually happening, right? And that can be scary and difficult, but it also, along with it comes a kind of, okay, maybe it's time to talk about the three great bodhisattvas, right? Like, there are three bodhisattvas that appear around the Mahayana Zen temples. One of them is Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion. One of them is Manjushri, the bodhisattva of wisdom. And the other one is Samantabhadra, the bodhisattva of activity, great activity, right? And what they are is they, along with another bodhisattva named, who in Japanese is named Jizo, are intended to represent the sort of pillars of the practice, right? And one of them is you Manjushri, the bodhisattva of wisdom, you enter the moment with your senses open, taking in the information, and with your open to your inner state and what's going on there, including your anger, right? Including your the narrative content of your mind, right? You bring up a mind of the bodhisattva of compassion you bring up a mind of sort of compassionate curiosity about what's actually happening, and a capacity to allow it to happen as fully as you possibly can, right? And then you let that confluence of energy and information suggest the thing to do next, and you do it, right? And then if you mess it up, you do that again. That's kind of how it works, right? And the one of the primary requirement there is that you be sufficiently compassionate with yourself to allow your anger and bring kind of, anger is almost always a response to something, and often that something requires empathic and sympathetic response, right? So to bring that along as well. And my experience is it works great. Does that help? Good. What else? Well, no. Well, let me just say a couple things, and then we can call it a night. So what's on offer, as I've kind of been saying already, is a life that feels alive, awake, and completely human, more than I think most of us thought possible. Certainly more than I thought possible. And a way of living that promotes that and instantiates it, especially in your moments of greatest need, right? Wonderful. And the practice of sitting is practice for that, and it also is its direct embodiment, right? And it's that embodiment that you carry with you when you stand up and you're walking around the world. And it's easy to say that. It has lots of aspects, and what I'm hoping to do is talk about those aspects in the context of this group, over the course of however long. So thank you for being here and listening, and I hope something about it was helpful. So take care. Yeah.
If you're here for the first time, we often hang out in the lobby and have tea after class. If you want to do that, you're welcome to. And logistical thing, the dance class in the back room meets the second and fourth Monday, and we meet every other Monday, so they'll almost never be going on at the same time. But today we got some dates, so it's fine.
Yeah, we did.
I was really present for the days.
Yeah.